Welcome back, ladies, gentlemen, and all else, to another episode of 3 Random Creepypastas, the show where I go on the Creepypasta wiki and find 3 random stories to read. I think you get the point by now, but if not, I'll forgive you for now. Without further ado, let's find 3 random creepypastas to read. Let's go! Alright, our very first story is known as Nor'easter, which is an interesting title, and it seems to have been written by a user known as Fentanyl Lollipops. Let's read our first story and see if it's any good. It was my great-grandfather, Conley Trevor, who built the original lighthouse on Small Grey Island back in the 1920s. Stories passed down in our family claim that he was the first human being to live on the island. The Penobscot people who settled the rest of the bay would go nowhere near Small Grey, and the European settlers who came later followed their lead. That same family lore also claims that he built the lighthouse with his own money and his own hands, after his fishing boats became grounded on a shoal nearby. It is a nice story, the kind of just-so tale that anyone would tell about a local hero, but any amount of digging puts the lie to it pretty quickly. It was Conley's idea, but the state of Maine funded the construction of the Small Grey Light, and a team of Irish and African American laborers laid the foundation and put brick over brick to build it up, often for wages too low to survive. Regardless of the truth of that old story though, Small Grey remained in our family through the 20th century. In 1957, the state put up a new lighthouse with an automatic signal, but my grandparents stayed nearby in the old keeper's house. They took in rent from the land where a, hopefully better paid, construction crew put up the new beacon, and expanded their halibut fishing business. The 1970s were the high-water mark for the large-scale operation that they started. At one point they had a small fleet of 4 boats, and an annual take worth 8 figures. The Trevor fishing dynasty died with them though. My mother had no desire to see it continue. She had gone to medical school and didn't want to give up her private practice in Jersey City, so she sold the relatively small operation to a larger company for a pretty lucrative sum. That company itself became a subsidiary of ConAgra 10 years later, and that was that. I followed in her footsteps, and just like her, I kept the old home as a vacation house. I've come here with my husband and daughter almost every fall to watch the coastal forests turn shades of ochre and bright red. It's a beautiful little slice of New England, one of those rare places that hasn't changed much since the first British colonists arrived in the 17th century. I always hoped it would stay that way, even as more beach houses popped up on the mainland from one autumn to the next. Indian summer this year ruined the show, although the pale blue sky and sharp lighting made for some beautiful photos from my husband's gallery. I took Lisa out on the sea kayak one evening to follow the coast. She hoped we'd see whales, but we weren't that lucky. Still, it was an experience for her. Probably the best one before the end of fall break. The weather turned pretty suddenly. I kind of expected a storm, but the one that popped up caught us all off guard. There was no time to get back to the mainland before the swell started to grow. First 5, then 10, and finally 30 feet in the bay, pounding at the cliff on the high end under the lighthouse. At least we had time to stormproof the house before the clouds and the howling wind swept in, coming southwest from the Gulf of St. Lawrence. There are so many things that I wish I'd done differently now, but this isn't even a case of hindsight being 20/20. It was safer by any reasonable estimate to wait out the storm here than trying to make it back in a 6-foot boat that isn't even really rated for the ocean. I couldn't have known what would come with the storm. The sound comes in through the boarded up windows and doors, through the walls and the roof, louder than the wind sometimes, even as the sheets of snow scream by and form tormented vortices in their passing. The hollow war drum of the thunder and the violent crash of the enormous waves can't drown it out. During the research that I did on the history of Small Grey Island, I discovered something else that went against those old family stories. Apparently Conley wasn't really the first person to live here anymore. Then he was a brave hero who built a lighthouse with his own sweat and blood. While the Irishmen dug the foundation, they found the remains of an old whaling station dating back 2 centuries. It had been knocked in and mostly burned to ashes. Along with the whale bones, there were human remains in the rubble. Historians from the University of Maine were called out and found more ruins on the other side of the island, on the low end near the future site of the house where we're all pinned in now. an old chieftain's house, richly decorated in the Algonquian style. Inside of it there were more skeletons, torn to pieces and marred by deep cuts, jagged lacerations like they'd been ripped apart by wolves. More digging found another pre-Algonquian site beneath that. There were more skeletons, these charred through to where the marrow was turned to black powder. It all fit together with reports among early European settlers in the area. Smallgrey was regarded by the coastal peoples as a dangerous place, probably because it was so exposed to the surf during severe weather. In legends, though, the storms brought something more than waves. They brought spirits and abominations up from the underworld. The souls of the lost, along with things too horrible to have names. Beasts that killed anyone on the island and dragged them down to the gloomy abode of the dead. Now that's all starting to make sense to me. I and my husband have been pretending that it's just a storm that we hear, but Lisa can't quit crying. To someone who hasn't learned to see the world as rational and ordered yet, the source of the tortured screams and demented chanting is obvious. We put in a distress call to the Coast Guard an hour ago, but the dispatch said that they can't fly out with the winds gusting to 70 knots. They just told us to shelter in place. I don't know what's really out there, but I'm afraid we're going to find out very soon. Oh, alright. That story, it was added very recently, just like 2 months ago, back in February. Nor'easter, fantastic story. I really enjoyed the storytelling on display here. The way the author built it up by first going into these legends about how Smallgrey Island was, founded and how it came into prominence back in the day, and how most of those stories are just legends and tales being told to almost sugarcoat the reality of the situation. And then as the story developed, how they started going deeper into the history, talking about all these skeletons being there, and then how obviously this land is probably cursed by the forefathers or the the people who used to live there all those centuries ago. Really interesting stuff, and of course the story had to be set in Maine. It couldn't be set anywhere else, because as we all know, Maine is the hotspot for all this type of stuff. I actually loved that. I thought that was really fantastic, really interesting, and the ending, of course, it ends rather abruptly, but sometimes that can be a negative, but in this case I feel it's a really great positive, because not only do you not know what happens next, you can leave that up to your imagination. I believe in this case that is a massive positive, because you can imagine, do the spirits of those who were there previously, do they come out and snuff out the lives of the main characters, or do they survive the winds, or what? It's really interesting to think about and really interesting to speculate on. All in all, I found that story to be really well written and really interesting. So, to the author, I highly commend you for this story. I was intrigued from the very beginning, and I felt it did not outstay its welcome. It was just the right length. Had just enough backstory to deliver on the events that transpired later on in the story, and left just enough to the imagination. So all in all, I would give that an 8, bordering on a 9 out of 10. I found that to be really interesting and intriguing. So all in all, great story. I really enjoyed that. With that said, let's find our second story. Alright, story number 2 is known as Watching Me, and it seems to have been written or added to the Creepypasta wiki by a user known as Cleric of Madness. We had great luck with the first story, so let's check this one out too. And once again, just in hindsight, this story deals with some serious topics, that being domestic violence and brief mentions of suicide. So if those are topics that are difficult for you to process at the moment, please feel free to skip this story or click off this video. I would completely understand. Do you believe in guardian angels? Something that watches over you and keeps you safe when it can. You don't have to be religious, but sometimes you may feel someone is watching over you. Sometimes it's not always what you expect. When I was younger, I lived with my father and his mother. I was the only child, a girl at that, and my father was very protective of me. My grandmother, on the other hand, hated me. At first, she would just yell at me and shove me around when Dad was at work. It escalated quickly after he started working longer hours to make ends meet. I rarely saw my father at that point. For 4 years, she did things I can't even bring myself to really think about, not enough to write it. For those 4 years, I prayed and prayed for release. I prayed and wished for her to die, to God, to whoever would listen. My dad probably would have believed me if I had had a chance to talk to him, but she'd made me feel as though I was such an abomination over the years that I couldn't bear it anymore. After she killed my kitten and made me bury it at the age of 13, I attempted suicide by hanging myself inside my closet. Apparently, I didn't know what the fuck I was doing, and the bar in the closet that I tied myself to fell on my head and knocked me the fuck out. After lying in the dizzying pain for what seemed to be hours, I pulled myself up and headed to sneak into the bathroom without the monster cunt to catch me and give me another beating. As I left my bedroom, I caught a whiff of something very fucking rancid, like vomit, burning flesh and blood, mixed together, warm. I knew all of these smells fairly well, considering what my grandmother did to me, and I thought for a moment it might have been my imagination, or her making something disgusting for me to eat to torture me even more. While I recognized the separate smells in a way, I'd never smelled something like this. As I got closer and closer to the stairs overlooking the living room, which was right across from the bathroom, I started to hear something. Faintly, I remember hearing it a few feet back, but suddenly it seemed so much louder. My head was pounding, my heart was pounding, and all I could hear was gurgle, smack, smack, squish, squish, rip. The mere idea of peeking over the stairs and into the living room was suddenly so profoundly frightening that I almost just went back into my bedroom, but strangely enough, it was amazingly easy to just do it anyway. What I saw in the living room will never leave me for as long as I live, in more than one sense. My grandmother was lying on the ground, someone in black kneeling over her crumpled body. They were both covered in blood. The person's head was moving rhythmically over its hands, which held what I then realized was an organ from her body. The person didn't look up, and I was scared silent. There was so much blood. The sound of gnawing, the smacking mouth, the snapping of her organs as they were ripped from my grandmother's body. What was left of it, the brutally grotesque sight of her chest cavity having been torn open, of her body being consumed little by little, filled me with terror that I had never known before. I didn't know what to do. It ate her body slowly, seeming to enjoy every bite it took, its body swaying and moving so unnaturally that I couldn't even think it was human. I couldn't stop watching, I couldn't run away. The sheer terror of it choked the scream I would have let out. It stopped. I stopped. It looked up at me after what seemed like an eternity, releasing the contents of its mouth. Gory pieces and blood, some brown at that point, covered most of its face. What I could see of the face, it seemed to be male, very pale in patches. Where eyes were supposed to be were black pits, pits that seemed to dilate, expand and retract. He had no lips, but his mouth twitched like some kind of hologram going in and out, slowly smiling, the smile expanding beyond normal human ability. I vomited and fainted. I woke up. My father was home and worrying over me. My grandmother's body was gone along with all the blood. "Where's Grandma? Where is she?" I kept asking him until I had to stop from the look in his eyes. He told me her heart was bad and she was in heaven now. I couldn't believe it. That was impossible, right? Did I imagine that whole thing? At her funeral on the way to her burial site, I saw the man again. He looked more human, but I knew it was him. I remembered that smile. I still have dreams about that man. Sometimes I think I see him in public. Even when I don't see him, I can feel him there. He's always there, watching me. Alright, that story was really, really interesting. Definitely on the shorter side, but I found that to be quite interesting. Very, very brutal. Very, very brutal. And quite disturbing in the way it described how this uh, guardian angel was eating the grandma. I don't know if there is really much else to say about the story. I felt it was quite solid and intriguing, and I enjoyed this concept of this corrupted or almost evil guardian angel who saw that the main character was in a really unfortunate situation with a grandmother that was treating them horribly, and then deciding to do something about it. And I then found the detail of when the main character woke up, and then the dad, had difficulties explaining what had happened. I found that to be interesting because he seemed, all things considered, if the guardian angel had, eaten her, he seemed rather chill about it. And then I really found the detail of when the main character woke up, and the dad said, that her heart was bad, and stuff like that. I found that to be interesting because does that imply that the vision that the main character had, was that just a vision conjured up by this guardian angel to please the main character in a way, to see that happen to the grandma, and then once they woke up again, the grandma's body sort of returned to normal, and it just seemed to be a death of natural causes or something like that. I found that to be really interesting, and that's something that I'll have to think about, because at the moment I don't really have the answers. But all in all, that was a pretty solid story. I found the writing to be pretty good. The concept was pretty interesting, and all in all, I felt that was a solid story. So that was a 6, probably, if I'm feeling generous, like a 7 out of 10. I found that to be interesting, it didn't really go that in depth, and didn't really describe, the environments all too much, but I felt it was rather solid in what it was trying to do. And it was rather disturbing in the way it was describing the grandmother's death. So all in all, solid story. So yeah, that's like a 6 out of 10 story. With that said, let's find our third and final story. Alright, our final story is known as The Mannequin Corpse, the second story to deal with a mannequin on this show. And this story was added to the Creepypasta wiki by a user known as Cyber Gaming Ninja in 2012 as well, so we're dealing with a lot of classics lately. We've had some pretty good luck with the first 2 stories, so let's see if we can finish it off with a third good one. Ever since I was a child, I feared mannequins. It felt like I was being watched by them. 3 years ago, I was working at a mall in Japan. My position wasn't really that important. The only thing I did was carry stuff. Anyway, my manager told me to get a male mannequin down at the basement. I went down to the basement. Everything was normal, nothing special, just bunch of items I don't really give a shit about. What happened there? How has no one corrected that in 8 years? I looked for mannequins. Most of them are dirty female mannequins and dislocated. I found a male mannequin this time, but for some reason it was heavy. Then I looked at the face of the mannequin, wondering why it was heavy. The mannequin started shaking. I thought it was an earthquake, so I looked at the other mannequins, and they were just chilling there. The mannequin stopped moving, but instead it started moaning. After it stopped moaning, it cried, "Help me! Save me!" I ran out of the basement, called my manager, and told him everything. He didn't believe me. I brought him down with me to the basement. When we went to the mannequin, it was just there, standing. Here's our conversation. Manager: "You crazy or what?" Me: "I'm telling the truth, believe me." Manager: "Listen, I don't want a person like you staying here in my mall. I let you have a day off for this week." Me: "Alright." Next week after that, I went back down to the basement. I checked the same mannequin. This time it didn't react to anything. I turned away, then when I looked back, the eyes of the mannequin was bleeding. "Don't leave me. Call for help," it said. Instead of running away like a cat, I picked up a crowbar and smashed the head of the mannequin with it. It was calling for help, dude! Why did you do that? There was something inside of that mannequin. It was a corpse. That mannequin has a dead man inside, but the weird part is, how the fuck was that corpse in there? That was my only question. The corpse suddenly started talking to me. "Release me. Save me! Replace me! I didn't want to destroy the mannequin. I think once I destroyed it, it will replace me inside of that mannequin. Where are you getting this information from? Also, how is this person inside the mannequin still alive? Who has been feeding them? And also, you're talking about it being a corpse. You were the one who just killed it. You just hit it with a crowbar. I tried running away, but it caught my arm. Don't leave me. Call for help. Save me. Release me. Replace me. I shoved the arm away from me and fled out of the room. Why are you not getting help? This person is asking you for help. Why are you not getting anyone to help them? In the history of that mall, it's about a man who died in the basement of that mall. How did he die, you ask? He was tortured by 6 men, made him unconscious. While he was unconscious, those men created a perfect mannequin shaped just like him. They cut the mannequin in half and placed that man inside the mannequin and joined the mannequin together again. 2 years later, the group of men were found dead, rotten skins. They had no clue of who killed those men. The only thing was the mannequin, covered in blood, with bleeding eyes, and mannequins that were shaped just like the 6 men. Wow! How is that story still on the wiki after 8 years? I'm sorry, I don't want to be too harsh to the author. And obviously, don't stop writing. Please keep writing stories, author. I'm sure you can write better stories, but this story... This story was not good, in my opinion. I mean, if you want to cut the story some slack, you know, based on the rather subpar writing, in my opinion, maybe you can excuse it by, you know, saying that, you know, maybe the author was writing it in a hurry. Maybe it's supposed to be like something that someone writes in a forum thread where grammar and spelling isn't, you know, top priority. But if we are critiquing this as a horror story, personally, I was not impressed in the slightest. This is definitely, if we're looking at every episode of this show that I've done so far, this is, in my opinion, the weakest story we have come across yet. I found it to be illogical. I didn't really understand the actions of the main character. And I mean, not to say that every main character of every story has to do the right thing or make the most logical choice all the time. I'm not saying that. But I just didn't get what the main character was doing. I didn't get what the story was trying to say or do. Overall, I found the story to be funnier rather than it was scary. Overall, I found it to be really weak, not interesting. I found it to be way too brief and at times unintentionally funny. So all in all, I found that story to be rather weak. I would probably give that a 3 out of 10, I will have to say. Obviously, I don't harbor any ill will towards the author. I just didn't personally enjoy your story, but please do keep writing and make more stories, because you will improve with each one you make, so keep at it. This story, however, was not very good in my opinion, and that's basically all I had to say about it. And that should basically be that. Alright, those were 3 random creepypastas. I certainly hope you enjoyed listening to them as much as I enjoyed reading them. We had one fantastic story, which is one of the best ones that I've read so far on this show, one that was quite good and interesting, and a third one that was probably the weakest one so far. So, this episode we really went up and down, but that really is the unpredictability of finding random stories here on the Creepypasta Wiki. With that said, that should basically be that. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and comment your thoughts down below. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Check out my social medias if you want to, or check out my Patreon page if you want to support the channel more directly. Thank you once again for the amazing support, and thank you so much for watching. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. Stay awesome, everyone. Goodbye. But Mannequin was alive and and it was scary.